For nearly 50 years, the world believed it understood exactly how Elvis Presley died. The story was simple, and it was cruel, and everyone repeated it. Too many pills, too many fried peanut butter sandwiches, a king who ate himself off his own throne inside the bathroom at Graceland. But buried inside a single lock of his hair, in the microscopic code that built his body, there was a different story waiting. A story his own biology had been trying to tell since the day he was born in a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi. And when scientists finally read it, decades after his death, what they found didn't just complicate the legend, it quietly rewrote the cause of the most famous death in music history. To understand what his DNA was hiding, you have to go back to the version of Elvis everyone thinks they know. The white jumpsuit under the Las Vegas lights. The trembling voice inside the Aloha from Hawaii, broadcast, beamed to 1 billion people. By any measure, this was the most watched, most photographed, most examined human being of his era. Cameras followed him into recording studios and out of hotel back doors. The public believed it owned every inch of him. And when his body began to fail in those final years in Memphis, the swelling, the exhaustion, the collapses, the world had already written its verdict before the coroner picked up a pen. He did this to himself. But here is the first thing science needs you to understand, because it changes everything that comes after. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the floor of his Graceland bathroom. He was 42 years old. The initial narrative pointed to a drug overdose, and that narrative was easy, and it stuck. Yet the official autopsy told a stranger story. His heart was enlarged, thickened, heavier than a man's heart should ever be. At the time, doctors filed it under the punishing lifestyle, a symptom of the excess. Nobody in that autopsy room in 1977 had the tools to ask the deeper question. Why was the heart of a 42-year-old built like that in the first place? That question sat unanswered for almost 40 years. Therefore, the myth hardened into fact, printed in every tabloid and every documentary until 2014, when a lock of Elvis's hair changed the entire conversation. The strand had been kept for decades, reportedly passed down from a friend of Presley's personal barber, and it carried something no biographer ever could. It carried his genome. A British television investigation called Dead Famous DNA brought that hair to a geneticist named Dr. Stephen Kingsmore, who at the time directed a genomic medicine center at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City. He wasn't looking for scandal, he was looking at the source code. And what he found in that code was the answer the 1977 autopsy couldn't reach. Inside Elvis Presley's DNA sat a gene mutation associated with a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Say it slowly, because this term reframes his entire death. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a hereditary heart disease. It causes the heart muscle, especially the wall of the left ventricle, to grow abnormally thick. That thickening makes it harder for the heart to pump blood the way it should. And crucially, it is today recognized as one of the leading genetic causes of sudden cardiac death in otherwise healthy people. It affects roughly 1 in 500 adults. Most of them never know they have it until the moment it matters most. Think about what that condition actually does to a life. The thickened heart doesn't announce itself. There is no visible bruise on an X-ray a 1970s doctor would flag. Instead, it hides, working harder underneath, until one day the electrical rhythm stumbles and the whole system fails without warning. The symptoms it does produce are the kind anyone would dismiss. Fatigue, an irregular heartbeat, dizziness, fainting spells, the very complaints Elvis struggled with in his final years in Memphis, the ones everyone blamed on exhaustion and excess. For a man whose entire career demanded relentless touring, back-to-back recording sessions, and the constant physical toll of the stage, a silent defect like this could keep hiding in plain sight for years, mistaken for the ordinary cost of being Elvis. Now hold that fact against the autopsy from 1977. A thickened heart. Doctors at the time had blamed the lifestyle, but the DNA suggested the thickening wasn't only earned in a Vegas dressing room or a Graceland kitchen. It was, at least in part, inherited. Written in before Elvis sang a single note, Kingsmore didn't hedge. He said the genetic findings were, in his words, an obvious fit with everything known about Elvis's clinical picture. A strong family history of heart failure, a sudden death, a heart that was physically, measurably enlarged on the table. The pieces the world had never bothered to connect were suddenly lying in a straight line. But the gene told an even wider story than his heart. When researchers read deeper into that same genetic sample, they found variants linked to a whole cluster of conditions Elvis quietly battled in life. Markers associated with migraines, the blinding headaches he was known to suffer. Markers linked to glaucoma, obesity, and cardiovascular stress. Suddenly, the private ailments of a superstar weren't random consequences of fame and appetite. They were, in part, a genetic inheritance he was carrying through every performance, every collapse, every long night in the final act of his life. The man the world called self-destructive had been fighting his own DNA the entire time. Here is why that distinction matters, and why it deserves to be said plainly. The story the world chose was a moral one. Elvis had everything, and Elvis wasted it, and Elvis died because of his own weakness. That version sold magazines, and it made people feel comfortable, because it meant his death made sense. It had a villain, and the villain was him. But the science offers something more uncomfortable and more human. A man can inherit a time bomb in the wall of his own heart and never be told it's ticking. Kingsmore made exactly that point. It is unfair, he argued, to blame Presley's death purely on the eating and the drugs, when there was a defect written into his DNA that no amount of willpower could have undone. And remember the timeline. In the 1970s, the genetic test that could have caught this simply did not exist. There was no way for any doctor at any clinic to look at Elvis and see the fault line running through his heart. He walked onto every stage carrying a diagnosis that wouldn't be readable for another 40 years, judged the entire time for a weakness that was never fully his fault. And yet the heart was only the first secret, because the deeper researchers and genealogists dug into where Elvis actually came from, the more his origin story refused to match the one his own family had told for generations. This is where the DNA stops being about how he died and starts being about who he truly was. The Presley legend, the one printed on souvenir pamphlets outside Graceland, was a simple American tapestry. Poor Southern boy, Scots-Irish roots, a proud Cherokee great-great-grandmother named Mourning Dove White, a story Elvis himself reportedly cherished and repeated. But DNA and old census records don't care about family pride. When genealogists traced the paper trail through 19th century Mississippi and Alabama, the neat story began to fray. Some census documents listing his ancestors did not confirm the Native American lineage the family treasured. Several entries recorded those same relatives simply as white. And running alongside that, another claim surfaced that stunned even longtime Elvis scholars. Along his mother Gladys's maternal line sat a great-great-grandmother named Nancy Burdine, a woman some researchers believe to be Jewish, said to descend from a family that had emigrated from what is now Lithuania. This wasn't idle rumor to Elvis, he seems to have known. When his mother Gladys died in 1958, Elvis had her headstone marked, and years later a replacement stone was created, carrying not only a cross, but a Star of David, in the segregated American South of that era. That was not a small gesture. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a bloodline the wider world never associated with the king of rock and roll. A hidden thread of heritage, memorialized in stone, sitting in plain sight at a Memphis cemetery for anyone who cared to look. But here is where honesty has to enter the story, because the truth is genuinely contested, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of myth-making. Modern genealogical researchers have pushed hard against both claims. Some have combed through the surviving records and concluded the Jewish ancestry doesn't hold up under document scrutiny, arguing that Elvis's actual maternal ancestor was a different woman entirely, a wife named Celia Butler, and that not a single verified record ties Nancy Burdine to his family tree at all. They point out how strange the origin story is on its face: an Ashkenazi woman from Lithuania somehow raising children deep in rural antebellum Mississippi. Others question whether the treasured Cherokee ancestor was ever Native American at all, noting that census takers repeatedly recorded those same relatives as white, and noting how often families in the Old South attached a proud Cherokee story to any ancestor who simply looked different. To complicate it further, Elvis's own maternal grandparents were first cousins, which knots the family tree so tightly that even professional researchers struggle to trace a clean line through it. The paper trail is a tangle. The oral history and the records openly disagree, and after all these years, no one can fully untangle which version is real. And that tangle is the real revelation hiding in Elvis Presley's DNA. Not a single clean secret, but a pattern that runs through his entire biology. The world wanted the simple version of everything about him. The simple death. The simple heritage. The simple morality tale of a man who had it all and threw it away. His genetic code refused to cooperate with any of it. His heart carried an inherited defect the myth ignored. His family tree carried claims of Cherokee and Jewish and Scots-Irish blood that historians are still arguing over today. Every layer that looked settled turned out to be contested the moment science looked closer. So what was actually hiding in Elvis Presley's DNA all along? The honest answer is the hardest one to put on a poster. It was a heart that may have been programmed to fail young, decades before the pills and the fried food the world blamed. It was a heritage far stranger and more disputed than the tidy Southern legend, complete with a Star of David on his mother's grave, and a Native American ancestor the census records quietly contradict. And underneath both, it was a truth about how we treat the famous. We would rather have a clean story than a true one. Elvis has been gone since that August morning in 1977. The questions never stopped, because he was the kind of figure whose life generated more questions than any single lifetime could answer. But among all of them, the ones his DNA can address, it has now addressed. His heart was likely built to betray him. His origins were more tangled than his family ever admitted, and the world's oldest story about him, that he simply destroyed himself, was never the whole truth. The whole truth was written in a language only a lock of hair, and a scientist patient enough to read it could finally translate. It was hiding there the entire time. We just preferred not to look.